When Congress chartered the Second Bank of the United States on a 20-year charter in 1816, the bank was given sweeping powers to direct federal monetary policy. One-fifth of the bank's directors were appointed by Congress, and the Treasury Department owned one-fifth of its stock. There were many who blamed the Second Bank of the United States, including Andrew Jackson, for the Panic of 1819. In 1819, in part to try to salvage the reputation of the bank, James Madison appointed Nicholas Biddle to head the federal portion of the bank, and in 1823, Biddle was unanimously voted president of the bank. Biddle believed that the bank was not answerable to Congress, but only to its shareholders. Jackson's opposition to the bank, meanwhile, was well known. Jackson blamed the bank for failing to create a uniform national currency. That charge was almost certainly untrue. But Jackson criticized the bank in his annual messages to Congress in 1829, in 1830, and in 1831. And every time Jackson criticized the bank, Nicholas Biddle and those who supported the bank became more and more nervous about the future of the bank's existence. During his first term as president, Andrew Jackson had determined to try to get rid of the Bank of the United States by redistributing the deposits to state banks. Now, Jackson's cabinet members opposed this move, but keep in mind that all of Jackson's original cabinet members, except for Secretary of State Martin Van Buren, resigned over the Peggy Eaton affair by 1832. They were replaced by an informal cadre of advisors that were called Jackson's Kitchen Cabinet. Henry Clay in the Senate, as well as Daniel Webster and other pro-bank men, tried to seek a recharter for the bank in 1832 during a presidential election year. Their plan was to try to force Jackson into what they thought would be a politically disastrous veto of the bank. And so Clay and his allies did, in Congress, get a recharter for the bank. The recharter made some concessions to Jackson's point of view, but Jackson famously said to Martin Van Buren at one point, he had become ill, and he said, "The bank is trying to kill me, but I shall kill the bank." Jackson vetoed what he called the Monster Corporation in 1832, despite the apparent political liabilities in it. But Jackson and his allies had attacked the bank so skillfully that, in fact, it turned into a political asset for him instead of a political liability, and Jackson won the presidential election of 1832 over Henry Clay by a large margin. You can see here the Electoral College of 1832 with Andrew Jackson beating out Henry Clay and other minor candidates. After his re-inauguration as president in 1833, Andrew Jackson took the election as a national mandate to get rid of the bank, and he began ordering his Secretary of the Treasury to redistribute the deposits from the bank into selected state banks. His Secretary of the Treasury, though, balked. He did not want to do it because he believed that Congress had to be consulted first. Jackson appointed another Secretary of the Treasury, who also came to disagree with Jackson on the issue. And finally, Jackson settled on Roger Taney as interim Secretary of the Treasury. And finally, it was Roger Taney who began withdrawing the deposits from the Bank of the United States and placing them into selected state banks, which were nicknamed Jackson's pet banks. The United States Senate, led by Henry Clay, formally censured Andrew Jackson. Jackson is the only U.S. president to ever be censured by the Senate. They called his actions regarding the bank an illegal use of presidential power, but Jackson had succeeded in killing the bank. The bank expired in 1836, but without the federal deposits. Nicholas Biddle and the other directors of the bank were more or less powerless to direct federal monetary policy during the last years of the bank. Out of the war on the Bank of the United States emerged the Whig Party. What was left of the National Republicans under Henry Clay and Daniel Webster formed themselves into really what became the opposition party to the Democrats. The Whigs were named after the British party of the same name, and their battle cry was executive usurpation, that Jackson had illegally usurped or abused his power as president. And anyone who opposed Jackson and the Democrats for any reason joined the Whigs, and it truly became the opposition party. You can see here Henry Clay, top, and Daniel Webster, bottom. And the Whig Party's focus throughout its existence, it was a pro-business party, it was a pro-bank party, it was a pro-commerce party. And the birth of the Whigs, gives birth to the second two-party system in the history of United States politics between the Democrats and the Whigs. By the time that Andrew Jackson took the presidency in 1829, he was already nearly 62 years old, and Jackson was in very poor health. He suffered from chronic conditions, and one of those conditions was a bullet that was lodged in his lung and had been lodged there since 1806. You see, Andrew Jackson had such a controversial and displeasing personality. He was engaged in dozens of duels throughout his lifetime, and in 1806 he actually shot and killed a man named Charles Dickinson in a duel after Dickinson had called his wife Rachel a bigamist. But Dickinson wounded Jackson in the chest, and Jackson actually carried that bullet in his lung for the rest of his life. In January of 1835, Andrew Jackson was also subjected to the first attempted presidential assassination in U.S. history. Richard Lawrence, an unemployed house painter, approached Jackson as Jackson was coming back from the funeral of a friend, and on the east portico of the Capitol, Lawrence attempted to shoot Jackson. Lawrence's pistol misfired, though. The second pistol he drew out also misfired. Those pistols are in the Smithsonian today, and the odds of them both misfiring, probably 10,000 to 1. Andrew Jackson, of course, who was known as Old Hickory, always carried a hickory cane on his person with a silver horse head on the handle, and Jackson began beating Dickinson with the cane, while other onlookers, including Congressman David Crockett, helped to wrestle Dickinson to the ground. Andrew Jackson lived to the ripe old age of 78. You can see a photograph of him there. In 1845, the same year that he finally passed away, but it's simply amazing that with his health and history of duels that he lived the long life that he did. In 1837, before he left office, Andrew Jackson issued an executive order stating that all federal lands could only be paid for in gold and silver specie. This so-called specie circular crashed the U.S. economy. It led to the Panic of 1837, land prices collapsed, and you can see here the political cartoon that came to epitomize Jackson's stance on the bank and his specie circular. This is called the modern Balaam and his ass. It's named after the story in the Old Testament in the book of Numbers, chapter 22, about the prophet Balaam. And if you recall the story, God had commanded Balaam to go somewhere, and Balaam didn't want to go. And so God sent an angel with a flaming sword to block Balaam's path, and the donkey could see the angel, but Balaam could not, and so Balaam began beating the donkey to try to get it to go forward, and finally God opened the donkey's mouth to speak, to essentially say, hey, I'm not going anywhere, there's an angel with a flaming sword blocking my path. Well, you can see that imagery recreated here in this political cartoon, and you can see Jackson, and the donkey, of course, represents the economy of the United States, which is being blocked by a lack of specie. And you can see Martin Van Buren, who was running for president in 1836, coming up behind Jackson saying, I will do as my illustrious predecessor has done. And Jackson actually liked this imagery so much, this is how the donkey became the symbol of the Democratic Party. Despite Jackson's actions as president, his successor, his vice president, Martin Van Buren had been Secretary of State during Jackson's first administration and vice president during his second, won election to the presidency in 1836, but Van Buren's term was immediately eaten up with things that Jackson had caused that left Van Buren scrambling. The Panic of 1837, and by 1839 was a full-fledged depression. Andrew Jackson had also diplomatically recognized the Republic of Texas the day before he left office, which agitated the slavery issue in the United States. Van Buren also had things to deal with, like the Amistad affair, in which the Spanish slaver, the Amistad, was taken over by enslaved African Americans on board the ship. And of course, they attempted to sail back to Africa, but they ended up in the waters off of Cape Cod. And so it became a United States case. The Van Buren administration was in favor of the position of the Spanish government, which is that they wanted the enslaved African Americans given back to them. And of course, the U.S. courts ruled against the Van Buren administration. So all of these things are going on. Martin Van Buren's term as president is eaten up with attempting to clean up messes that Andrew Jackson had left for him. You can see here the Electoral College of 1836, Vice President Martin Van Buren winning the presidency over the Whig candidate William Henry Harrison, as well as other minor candidates. As the presidential election of 1840 approached, the Whigs again nominated William Henry Harrison. Harrison was the hero of the Battle of Tippecanoe back in 1811, and so he had taken the nickname of Tippecanoe, or Old Tip. And as vice president, the Whigs nominated John Tyler. Tyler, of course, a states' rights Whig from Virginia. Tyler had broken with the Democrats and Jackson, though, over nullification. He believed that Jackson should have allowed nullification to go through. And so this pair runs as the Whig candidate for president and vice president in 1840. During the campaign, the Democrats mocked Harrison. They said that Harrison was completely unqualified to be president, and that if he were elected, he would merely go back to his log cabin in the backwoods and drink hard cider. The Democrats essentially are criticizing Harrison for being too much of a commoner. At least that's how the Whigs spun it. The Whigs responded and said, yes, Harrison is the type of man who lives in a log cabin and drinks hard cider. He's just like you. And so it became the Log Cabin and Hard Cider campaign of Tippecanoe and Tyler too. 1840 was really, in many ways, the first modern presidential campaign. You had mass electioneering, grassroots organization. At their campaign rallies, the Whigs served liquor provided by two brothers who owned a liquor company, the Booze Brothers, Booze. So this is where we get the term booze from. Meanwhile, Martin Van Buren, who had belonged to the Kinderhook Club in New York, took the name Old Kinderhook. So Old Kinderhook was okay. Now, the word okay, this was not the first usage of it in the English language, but this is where it became popularized. So you have Martin Van Buren, the Democrat, who is okay, versus the Log Cabin and Hard Cider Campaign of Tippecanoe and Tyler too, who are serving booze at their rallies. The election drew a lot of attention. In fact, it's the highest voter turnout on record. 78% of eligible U.S. electors turned out to vote. And in the election, Harrison and Tyler won. But that was not the end of the drama. 2 weeks after he took office in March of 1841, William Henry Harrison became seriously ill. The nature of his illness is still unclear, although it was probably not pneumonia, as the doctor put on his death certificate. 2 weeks more, and on April 4th, 1841, exactly 30 days into office, William Henry Harrison died. He was the first U.S. president to die in office, and his term is also the shortest term of any U.S. president. John Tyler, his vice president, became president, and Tyler actually managed to head off a bit of a constitutional crisis. The Constitution says that the vice president shall act as president in the case of the death of the president. Well, what exactly does that mean? No one was quite sure, but Tyler decided that he was, in fact, president, not just acting as president, but was, in fact, president. And that's, of course, set a precedent that whenever the president dies in office, the vice president becomes president, not just acting as president, but actually the president. And so Harrison's term came to an untimely end, and John Tyler becomes president of the United States. Here you can see the Electoral College of 1840 with Harrison and Tyler, Tippecanoe and Tyler too, beating out Old Kinderhook, Martin Van Buren. Here you can see President William Henry Harrison on the left and President John Tyler on the right. Just to illustrate the youth of our country, John Tyler, who was born in 1790 and died in 1862, as of right now, in April of 2020, John Tyler has 2 living grandsons.